You want me to look at you or look at the
You
camera?
look at me. It's really the same thing, isn't it?
That's fine.
Yeah, because it works that way. Okay, we're talking today with Newt Dilley of Grand Rapids, Michigan. The interviewer is James Smither of Grand Valley State University. Mr. Dilley, why don't you begin by telling us a little bit about your background? Where were you born? Where did you grow up?
Well, my name is A. Newton Dilley. My first name is Alva, which I don't use for obvious reasons. It's a family name. I'm 84 years old. I was born and raised in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Attended Sigsbee School and Ottawa Hills High School, from which I graduated in 1941.
Was it called Ottawa Hills when you went there?
Ottawa Hills.
I thought it wasn't South
Yeah,
or something like
that's
that.
the one at Iroquois. It used to be the middle school.
Mm-hmm. All right. What did your family do?
I'm sorry?
What did your family do? Your father?
I'm a lawyer, and my father was a lawyer. So when I graduated from law school in 1950, I joined my dad in the practice of law here in Grand Rapids.
All right. I'm going to go back up then a little bit here. Now, when you were growing up, if you can remember back in the 1930s a little bit, how well was your father doing at that point? I mean, he's a lawyer. Was he making a decent living then, or?
My father practiced law for many years with his brother Abner Dilley, and then that situation evolved to the point where they both went their separate ways, and my father practiced law with other lawyers in 2 or 3 different firms,
Mm-hmm.
but it was a loose association of lawyers whereby they probably shared the overhead and the secretarial
Mm-hmm.
expense and had their individual practices. So basically he was an individual
Mm-hmm.
practitioner. He was a general practitioner. He tried, he was a litigator, trial lawyer, and he practiced in all courts, federal, state, district and circuit courts, and served a long and distinguished career. He actually graduated from the University of Michigan Law School in 1913,
Mm-hmm.
and he was of all the Dilleys that ever have been in Grand Rapids as lawyers, and there are many of them. There are probably 10 or 12. He was the first one to come here right out of Michigan Law School
Mm-hmm.
and got a job with a lawyer who was in practice here at that time.
Mm-hmm. And how many kids were in your family?
How many
Yeah.
siblings do I have?
Yeah.
I had 2. I had a brother and a sister, both of whom were deceased,
Mm-hmm.
and they were both older than I. I was the baby
Mm-hmm.
of the family, and all of us were born here. And of course, my father and mother have been here all of those years. And my father died in 1967, and my mother died 4 years later. So,
Okay. Now, did you enter the military directly out of high school, or?
well, that's somewhat interesting because my father and mother, for some reason, wanted me to go to school in the East.
Mm-hmm.
And my father was acquainted with a man named Applegate, who was a devoted Colgate University alumnus. And he got interested in seeing that if I would be interested in going to Colgate, result of which was that I did go to Colgate. And I graduated from Ottawa in 1941.
Mm-hmm.
In June, immediately went to Colgate in September of 1941, which was 3 months before Pearl Harbor.
Mm-hmm.
So I was only in my college career, so to speak, for a matter of 3 or 4 months before Pearl Harbor occurred.
Mm-hmm.
And I then enlisted because all of us either immediately enlisted or enlisted around that time because we knew we were going to be called very shortly after the war began. I enlisted in Syracuse because Colgate's in Hamilton, New York, which is only about 40 miles
Mm-hmm.
southeast of Syracuse, and that was the nearest recruitment center. So I went up there and enlisted, and that was in December of 1942. And by enlisting, as all of us knew at that time, you could complete your current semester,
Mm-hmm.
or at least until you were called to active duty.
Mm-hmm.
I tried to get into the Marine Corps, I tried to get into the Air Force, but I did not have the eyesight for either one. And so the Army was the only option I had, and I enlisted in the Army in December of 1942.
Okay. Then once you went to enlist, sort of where did you go for training and what were you doing?
I was called I was called to active duty in 1943, and that was June 9th, 1943, and I reported to Fort Custer, Battle Creek,
Right.
and then was immediately put on a train with the many other of us enlistees and sent to Camp Roberts, California, which is about halfway between San Francisco and Los Angeles,
Okay.
at a camp called Camp Barclay. I'm sorry, not Barclay. It was Camp Barclay is where I reported to the 12th Armored Division.
Well, you had said Camp Roberts. Was there a
Camp Roberts. I'm sorry, Camp Roberts, which is near a little town called Paso Robles, California. It's right out in the California desert.
All right. Now, let's see, had you had much opportunity before then to travel around the country? I mean, I guess you'd made it between Michigan and Colgate at least, but had you been out west before?
I did go out to Colorado. I never had been west of Colorado because I had an uncle. In fact, my uncle Newt lived in Texas but had a cottage in Colorado. And I'd visited him and my other relatives on the Dilley side, both in Texas and Colorado. But other than that, I hadn't done very much traveling in those days. We didn't really get around the way we do today.
All right. What did you think when you got to Paso Robles? I mean, what did that area look like around Camp Roberts?
A very small town. Of course, by that time, 1943, June of 43, the country was gearing up and getting into the war effort, preliminary stages, really, because the country hadn't yet really geared up either personnel-wise or production-wise from the standpoint of material, probably until middle of 1944. But the camp itself was very well. It was we lived in wooden barracks, plywood barracks, right out in the desert country. I remember we used to play with tarantulas. We would pour canteen water down tarantula holes and get tarantulas to come out, and that was a real new experience for a kid from the Middle West, because we had heard the word tarantula but never seen one.
Were the men you were in camp with from all over the country at that point?
They were from all over the country, all walks of life. And I felt that they, generally speaking, our officers, our training officers, as well as my fellow enlistees, were very seemingly bright, well-educated generally, but still from all walks of life, good people and good recruits. We were all eager in those days to get into the war and do our part, and it was the country pervasively felt that way. I think there was great unanimity, which hasn't been true since, as far as I'm concerned.
Now, to think back a little bit, at the point there where you were starting college back at Colgate, and before Pearl Harbor itself, had you been paying much attention to kind of the world news and what was going on?
Not much.
Okay.
Not much.
And so you weren't really thinking about the prospect of getting into a war or anything else like that?
Well, everybody talked about that because of the fact that, the Lend-Lease program and Franklin Roosevelt, of course, initially was very reluctant to become involved, and that's, of course, all historical fact. But then as it became more and more obvious that our involvement was inevitable, all of us, I think, in high school even, as I graduated and as I went to college, it was on everybody's mind and everybody's conversation. So we were pretty much, I should correct what I said before, we were pretty much tuned into what was going on.
Okay. Now, when you got out there to camp, was it kind of a shock to go into a system with military discipline and all of that, or was it an easy adjustment for you?
Well, I don't believe so, because we were all so prepared to go through a very life-changing experience, and it was something that you just, after all, this is by June of 1943. I certainly was not among the first to go into the service after Pearl Harbor. I was very fortunate in being allowed to finish an extra semester of college before I was actually called up, after I enlisted. And so you were really quite prepared mentally for new experiences and a totally different existence. And I adapted well, and I think everybody that I don't know of anyone in my basic training experience, which was, I think it was either 60 or 90 days, I think it was 90 days, who had a problem mentally with what they were going through.
Okay. How did the drill instructors and people like that treat the recruits?
Oh, we had a guy named Ernie Johnson, who was an ex-big league pitcher, major league pitcher. And Ernie was a terrific guy and a wonderful instructor, very friendly and very open. And we all appreciated his candor and his ability. And he was there every morning at 6 o'clock to get us out of bed. And uniformly, I think we all had a lot of respect for our officers.
Okay. Now, did any of these men at this point have combat experience? Were you being trained by people?
No, we were all green recruits.
But I meant the instructors themselves.
Instructors, far as I know, none of them had combat experience. Not to say that there might not have been officers there, particularly further up. As a buck private, I wasn't acquainted with anybody but my instructor, and he was a sergeant, so I wasn't. I couldn't really answer that.
Okay. Now, what kind of things did they have you do in that kind of 90 days there?
We trained hard every day. We did field training, a lot of rifle training, marksmanship, compass work, overnight hikes, bivouacs. We did some motorized work mechanically with jeeps, and of course we used a lot of jeeps because that was the normal mode of transportation. Either a 6x6 truck or a jeep was how we got around, and we had very little exposure at that time to anything like a half track or a tank, which of course I did train with when I got in later at the 12th Armored Division.
Right. Were you trained on other weapons, mortars, machine guns, things like that?
Mortars, machine guns, and M1 rifles. And I'm not sure whether we got into Burke guns, what they used to call grease guns. It's a 45 caliber pressed steel submachine gun. Whether we got into it in basic training or when I got to the 12th Armored Division.
Okay. So where did you go then after Camp Roberts?
After Camp Roberts, we had applied, many of us, particularly the college, many of us had college experience, and many of us had not. But particularly the ones who had some college exposure volunteered for a program called the Army Specialized Training Program, otherwise known as ASTP, which is very familiar to all of us at that time. And what had happened was that as the war progressed, the military, in its infinite wisdom, the War Department determined that we were desperately short of engineers, and we needed engineers. And the bulk of the people who went into the Army Specialized Training Program went in to be trained as engineers, and that's what happened to me. I was transferred eventually to Santa Rosa, California, which was a staging area for reassignment to a specialized training program. And I wound up in New Mexico at New Mexico A&M, New Mexico College of Agricultural and Mining Arts, which I think is still very much extant for my training. And I wasn't there very long, a matter of maybe 6 months, before the Army then did a reverse course, determined that they had plenty of engineers, thank you very much, and that of course, meanwhile, I'm sure some of the people had been graduated as engineers, so they disbanded the whole thing, and all of us, to the last man, were reassigned, most all of us, to infantry divisions all over the country.
Right. Okay, and then where did you get sent?
I was transferred to Abilene, Texas, to the 12th Armored Division, which had been in training many months before we arrived. There were probably 20 or 30 of us that wound up with the 12th Armored Division in various units of the 12th Armored Division. And let me see, when was that? That was, 20 or 30 classmates.
Was this early in '44 then?
It would have been in, I think, about June of 1944. I'm referring here to an outline of my service, which I had prepared. I got to Abilene in March of 1944, and went through Armored Division training. I was assigned to the headquarters platoon of the 56th Armored Infantry Battalion of the 12th Armored Division. 12th Armored Division had 3 Armored Infantry battalions. There were no regiments in an Armored Division. You had division, battalion, company, and platoon was your breakdown.
And then didn't they group the battalions and units into combat commands?
They were combat commands. When we got into combat, we were divided up into combat commands. And so I was in the headquarters unit. The headquarters unit performed all kinds of functions. Of course, I was in the recon platoon, reconnaissance platoon, and we did everything. We did everything from road guides to reconnaissance patrols to seemed like, of course, when you were a buck private, you did your share of KP and latrine duty. But we were the kind of when they didn't know who could do something, we were usually sent to do it. And so, but we trained in jeeps, we trained in half tracks, we trained in tanks, although there were tank battalions also a part of the Armored Division. But our basic units, mechanized units, were half tracks and jeeps, and some scout cars. But normally they were jeeps and half tracks is what we trained in.
All right. Now, were you assigned to the reconnaissance platoon because you were the new guy and they give you the worst job, or was there some other logic?
Absolutely. We were the new guys. We were the college kids, and of course, as I think is probably normal in the Army, if you were a college kid or had some exposure to college, and I had very little really. You got all of the dirty jobs and all the kidding and all the ribbing, all of which was good-natured. I never remember being given a really bad time or bad initiation, so to speak, just because I'd been to college. It didn't take long before we weren't college kids. We were armored troopers, and of course I was still a buck private, as were all of my ASTP comrades, and so they were pretty good to us.
All right. How long was it before you went over to Europe?
Well, we trained until September 5 of 1944. So that would be from March to September of 44. I was in training. We boarded the Essen, Topeka, and Santa Fe train in View, Texas, which was probably 20, 30 miles from Abilene, which was right out in the middle of nowhere. and went to Camp Shanks, New York, which was a staging area, and then boarded 3 ships. I was on the Empress of Australia with many other of us, and we debarked October 1st of 1944 in Liverpool.
Okay. Tell us a little bit about the ship you were on. Was this a converted passenger liner or something
It was
else?
a converted passenger liner. Not a particularly large ship, and of course they put us through the typical abandoned ship training, because there were many ships, as you know, that were not only troop ships, but there were oil tankers and all manner of ships that were sunk by the Germans. The Germans were very active at that time in the Atlantic and along the East Coast, so we had abandoned ship training, went through all of that, and but we arrived, and the whole division arrived unscathed and without any particular incident.
Okay. So you make it to Liverpool, and then how quickly did they get you from England over into France?
Well, we went into some training at a place called Tidworth Barracks, which was in the southwestern central, what they called the English Plains.
Yeah, the Salisbury Plains, probably.
Salisbury Plains, exactly. And a little town near there, and I can't remember, I have it here somewhere, that's not important. But we trained there for a while, and I got the flu. We were living in tents, and although we had wooden floors, it was wet, damp, typical British fall weather, and we just froze to death every day. And I got flu to the extent that I wound up in the hospital. And I was in the hospital probably a good 10 or 12 days, quite ill, really, with a high fever that persisted and so forth. And my friends came to see me about every day or every other day. And one of them told me that they were about to be shipped out. In fact, they had their orders to ship out 3 days later. And I called the head nurse and I said, I'm leaving the hospital. I want you to discharge me. And which happened because I knew if I missed the division going to France, I would be put in a replacement depot, and I'd wind up God knows where. And I wanted to be with my friends and comrades with whom I had trained and whom I had gotten to know very well, and so I insisted that I be discharged, and I got back and went over to. We actually boarded an LST with our tanks, half tracks, and equipment, and went to Le Havre and landed in Le Havre, and we landed. Well, I say a few days after November 9. I don't actually know of the date, but it was a few days after November. This was November of 44.
Okay. What did you, when you were in England, to what extent did you get to look around at all or see what the countryside was like or meet any of the people?
You know, I think we had one short leave with a couple of my friends to London, and that was about it. We really, you know, as a buck private and you're about to be shipped over, we were interested in getting the best training and keeping our nose to the stone, because we knew it was just our ship out to combat was a matter of day to day, and we wanted to get all the training we could. So we weren't preoccupied with seeing the sights, so to speak.
Right. Now, while you were getting the training in England, were there people now helping train you who had been in combat against the Germans?
Yes.
And what were they telling you about the Germans, and especially the German armor, or the kinds of things that your unit might have to deal with?
Well, as an armored division, and of course the 12th Armored Division had no history prior to its organization in the States, many months, as I said, before I joined them. But as an armored division, and of course there had been considerable armored experience in North Africa by that time, fighting Rommel, and the divisions down there in North Africa that had to deal with Rommel got a good deal of combat experience, much of it unfortunate as far as armor was concerned. So we did have some technical advice and training I don't remember any particular officers who had been into combat. It was more of a situation where our officers were being trained
Right.
but on the basis of the experience that had been achieved, and then relaying it to us.
Right. Okay. So, I guess with an infantry unit, you're not normally going to be expected to engage enemy armor directly. But did you have things like bazookas or anti-tank weapons in your unit?
Absolutely.
Okay.
We had a considerable training in bazookas. We had considerable. We had anti-tank units that had anti-tank weaponry.
Right.
So we weren't trained on that
Right.
so much
Right.
as we were trained as infantry, but armored infantry.
Right.
So you're having to be trained to fight with and in the company of tanks and armor, half tracks, scout cars, light tanks, jeeps, rapid movement.
Okay. Were you trained to sometimes ride on the tanks themselves and go in that way, or would you normally stick with the half tracks and the
We
vehicles?
were never trained to ride on tanks, and when we got into combat, I can relate a particular story that happened to me that involved getting on the back of a tank.
All right.
But we were never trained to do that because, I mean, nobody thought about something like that being a necessary or certainly a good thing, because you're a sitting duck out there with nothing to protect you.
Right. Okay. So you kind of finish your spell in England. You get on the LST. You get across to Le Havre. What did that part of France look like when you got there?
Bleak, various stages of destruction, because of course we went in behind the front, which
Right.
at that point had moved pretty much. I think Paris had been liberated by the time we got into action. We were initially went into a kind of a holding pattern at a little town called Offray. I think that's AUF small town, French town, not far from the coast, probably 20 miles inland. And then within a few days, we were assigned to the 7th Army, General Patch's 7th Army, which was the army that landed in southern France and came up the east side of France, bordering Switzerland, and was up in Alsace, near Strasbourg, when we joined them. And that's where we saw our first combat and went into action at that time.
Okay. Can you describe that experience? What happened there, and that when you first head into combat, what were you doing and what did you see?
Well, again, as a buck private, infantry private, that was concentrating on taking orders and carrying them out, I'm the last person that should be called upon as a historian, but we were in combat. We were in the shooting part of the war. We were trying to get our first taste, and our initial contact was not too difficult or too bloody, so to speak. We were kind of introduced to it. Generally, we were given some objectives early on involving several units, but not entire units of the various battalions and tank battalions. Small units were attacking towns and trying to clean out German resistance. Because remember, this was all on the French side of the Rhine.
Right.
And this was the so-called Colmar pocket, which eventually we were asked to reduce, and that's where we got involved with considerable combat. So we were preliminarily doing relatively small engagements to gain experience. And it wasn't until the Battle of the Bulge, in connection with which there was an operation by the Germans called Nordwind, which was basically a diversionary tactic by the Germans to diffuse defense of the Bulge, that we saw really hard combat.
Okay. Well, part of course, what we're after here with this kind of interview is less the larger scale military history, which you're saying, you're not the man to tell me about. It's more the individual experience. And so, if you can tell us something about just what was going through your head, or just what it was that you saw and did when you're on your first mission and you're sent out. Now, as with a reconnaissance unit, were you going to look to see where they were, or did you already know where they were?
Well, we did everything. We went on night patrols. I know that I was in a foxhole many nights, to the extent that I got frostbitten feet, as did so many of us, because our equipment was terrible, our clothing was terrible, and it's well documented. It's not anything that people don't understand and know, because our boots, all we had were the typical GI leather shoe, which were no protection whatsoever to dampness or cold. And I can remember nights when I would be out in a foxhole for 6 or 8 hours straight without relief, listening to German patrols going by. We were being very quiet because we had no possible means of defending ourselves if they decided to encounter us or come our way. But we just, in those days, we were just trying to survive. And when we got into combat, it was a day-to-day thing that you just followed orders and did the best job you could. And I don't have any particular recollection of incidents other than the one I've related. I dug a lot of foxholes. We all spent a lot of time trying to keep our bodies from freezing. The German clothing was far superior to ours, and any time we could relieve a German corpse of his clothing or his boots, we certainly did so, particularly as we got into combat into January of 1945, which is when we got into the heavy end of the fighting in Colmar Pocket, a place called Herlisheim, which is a famous, the most famous battle that the 12th Armored Division ever fought. It was a little town called Herlisheim, which is in France, but right near Strasbourg in that Colmar Pocket, when we attacked the Germans and lost many hundreds of members of our division.
Now, what role were you playing in that, or what was your unit doing?
I did everything, as did my platoon. We did night patrols. We did outpost work. We did artillery spotting. We did road guiding. We did headquarters message running. Somebody would say, "Dilley, go get Lieutenant Smith and tell him we're gonna have a meeting at 0600 in the morning, and we're gonna do this and so, and be sure and report back to me that you've done that." And I would take off, and by one way or another, I would find Lieutenant Smith. And so we were doing it. We were so busy in those days, doing a multiplicity of job, all manner of job, trying to survive. We weren't actually shooting at Germans, so to speak. We were too busy doing other jobs. Remember, I was in a headquarters unit, not a frontline unit, so to speak, with the battalion that I was attached to. We were part of the headquarters unit, so we were fortunate in that we were not actually out in the frontline trenches most of the time. We did see some of that, but most of the time we were doing the things that I've just described.
Okay. Tell me a little bit about the artillery spotting part. What kind of stuff did you have to do for that job?
Well, we would be out on outpost and have a radio, and the primary job was to see where our shells were landing. Now, the artillery had their own spotters, but we would fill in occasionally, or we would happen to be in a certain area where the order would come in, we need some help with spotting. And so we did some of that, not a lot of it, but some of it, because they really wanted their own spotters.
Right.
They knew how to calibrate, they knew how to measure, they had the equipment and the training to do that. And so our intelligence, so to speak, our information was limited to some extent because of lack of training. But we did do some of that.
So when you were up there, particularly toward the front lines, to what extent could you see or figure out what was going on? And you're again not the one that's going to tell you a whole heck of a lot, but do you have situations where you could watch some part of the fight unfold or get a sense of what was going on?
I was in an observation post in an old house that was probably 75–80% destroyed, up in an attic window. And I could see this was when we were in that Battle of Herlisheim. We were in a town called Rohrweiler, which is a neighboring town there. And the Germans were in Herlisheim. And I was on outpost one day, and one of our tanks, this sounds absurd, but it's a true statement. One of our tanks had the turret open, and the tank commander standing up in the turret, and he took a mortar shell right down the turret.
Wow.
And destroyed all of the people in the tank, as well as disabled the tank. And I wasn't looking right at it at the time, but when the shell exploded, I saw it. He was probably 400 or 500 yards in front of where I was, but of course we had binoculars. And later on I heard that that's what had happened, because we couldn't figure out what had happened. We can't see a mortar shell.
Right.
My division lost 1,700 killed, wounded, and captured in that battle. It lasted over about a week. We made multiple attacks. It was a tragic situation for the reason that the countryside was cut up with canals and rivers, which is the worst possible terrain for an armor division. We had no business being sent to that area, no business being ordered to attack entrenched Germans who had overwhelming firepower, 88s, which was the most devastating artillery weapon of the entire war on either side. And we lost 29 tanks in one attack. We lost almost the entire 17th Armored Infantry Battalion in my division in 2 days of fighting. And it was really a terrible experience for everybody. To the extent, I was very fortunate, as I've tried to indicate, in being, or just by pure happenstance, a member of a platoon that was not actively attacking.
Right.
Although at one point, and I alluded to this earlier, because we had failed and had withdrawn, attacked, gotten chopped up so badly, finally everybody was ordered. We were all going to be the S4 people, which is the supply people, the headquarters company, the headquarters platoon. All of us were going to be involved in an attack, and we were actually sitting on the backs of tanks in Rohrweiler. We were going to go across the opening and through these small confined bridges that were still intact to get towards Herlisheim. And we were all scared to death because we knew that this was going to be it. And at the last second, literally 5 minutes before the time of the attack, we were to kick off. And the attack was canceled. I mean, somebody finally woke up that this was suicide. And we were all told to get off the tanks, and it didn't take any of us 10 seconds to get off of those tanks.
Did the division manage to take the town, or did other units have to come?
We eventually took the town, but by that time we had support. We were actually relieved because we'd been so bloodied and lost so many men. We were actually relieved by the 36th Division, which is a very experienced infantry division, U.S. division, and of course they were not They were not an armored division. They were an infantry division, foot division, and they were a sight for sore eyes for those of us who had survived the Herlesheim battle.
So they had 9 battalions of infantry, and you had 3.
That's
so
right.
For that kind of attack, that would
That's
make
right.
a pretty big difference. You had also mentioned the German Operation Nordwind, which I think it kicks off in January of '45, around the same time.
That's right.
Now that was an offensive. So were you defending against German attacks, or were you then counterattacking?
Well, it was kind of both. We were defending because Nordwind was an attack.
Mm-hmm.
The Germans, although they had a small bridgehead, they did not have a large presence on the French side of the Rhine. And they reinforced those troops and then advanced. And we contained them and then tried to reduce the area and drive them back across the Rhine, which we eventually did. And of course, the whole Colmar, they used to call it the Colmar pocket, was eventually reduced. And of course, the Germans then no longer, after the Bulge was eliminated, the Germans were no longer, of course, on the French side of the Rhine, and then the great retreat and attack across Germany and Austria began.
Mm-hmm. What do you recall seeing or witnessing during that time of the German offensive? I mean, were you seeing Germans attacking your units at certain points along the way, or?
You mean after Herlesheim?
Yeah.
My recollection, and I have to, I think I indicated to you the other day that I had, when we were in England, a buddy of mine and myself signed up for officer candidate school. And we just did it because they asked if anybody was interested, and we did it as just a matter of kind of curiosity. Totally forgot about it. And it wasn't until we were in Germany, and my recollection is we were somewhere between Speyer and Würzburg, when I was sent back to OCS at Fontainebleau, France, right outside of Paris, to officer candidate school. And I think it was sometime in April or May of 1945, because my actual officer candidate school was actually from April 20th to June 16th, so it was only a 2-month course. It wasn't a battlefield commission, but it was about as close as you could get time-wise to a commission as second lieutenant in the infantry. So I estimate, because I had about a week's leave in Paris before I had to report to Fontainebleau, I estimate that I left the front somewhere around the 10th or 12th, 13th of April, 1945, and I believe we were well into Germany and it started our advance. I can remember the carnage of and the difficulty of overtaking retreating German equipment and personnel, German dead and wounded, equipment, abandoned tanks, burned out tanks, dead horses, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. I can remember how difficult it literally was to advance sometimes because of abandoned German equipment.
Now, would that have been units that had been hit by aircraft or
hit by everything? They were, a lot of it was aircraft, and I would say a great share of it was aircraft, because as an armored division we were long ahead of the foot soldiers, the infantry.
And if you still had a lot of obstructions on the roads, then it hadn't been as if another mobile unit had gone in front of you and cleared it off.
So a lot of it was our advanced units, but a lot of it was the devastating effect of our air support, bombing and strafing by our aircraft.
Okay. Now, when your unit was going forward, so after you've kind of had your Herlesheim battle and so forth, when you're going forward and going into Germany, were you going into the part of Germany that was west of the Rhine first, or did you go directly across the Rhine from Alsace?
I think we crossed the Rhine at Worms.
Okay.
I
part of
think
the
that's
North?
where, one of the units, as I recall, one of the units of my division, the 12th, was one of the first units to reach the Rhine.
Mm-hmm.
So we were right up there, and meanwhile we had been reassigned at the time of the Bulge, or after the Bulge developed. We were reassigned to Patton, and after we reduced the Colmar pocket, we were sent up actually in reserve up at the Bulge.
Okay.
We never were involved in the Bulge combat, but we were in a supporting position west of the Bulge. And then once that had been eliminated, the threat had been eliminated, then we crossed the Rhine, I believe at Worms, and the 12th Armored Division was on its way across Germany. We were one of the leading elements. Actually, we were called the Mystery Division because when we were reassigned to Patton, General Patton, they didn't want the German to know we had been added to his force, and they called us the Mystery Division. But it turned out that the Germans were well aware that the 12th was there, and the Germans had a lot of respect for our division because of what we had gone through at Herlisheim, and they were familiar with the 12th Armored Division.
Okay. Describe a little bit what you saw, or whatever, at the point when you're crossing the Rhine. I mean, kind of what did it look like? What were the physical conditions there?
Well, of course, by this time it was early spring of 1945, and the situation was very, very fluid. We were my platoon. We were doing everything. We were. I remember one day when we were on patrol, drove through this little town which seemed to be relatively intact, not destroyed, which was at that point kind of unusual because we were getting into countryside that had not really seen the war up close. And as we went through town, I was riding in the Jeep, and I had a driver, and I've forgotten what our mission was at that point, but I happened to look over my shoulder as we drove through this town. Of course, the streets in those little towns are very narrow. I saw a German soldier looking out of a door of a house right off the road. And I told Ken Rousey, my driver, to stop the car. I jumped out of the Jeep, and without really even thinking about it, I certainly didn't consider it anything heroic, or it would just almost did it as a matter of course. I went up and ran up with just my M1 and opened the door, went through the door into this room, and it was full of German soldiers. I mean, if any of them had the slightest interest in killing me, I would have been dead right there, because I was totally surprised, and it's one of those oh my goodness times. And of course, in those days we didn't use polite language like that. But it turned out that they were finished. They were done. They were waiting to surrender. They wanted to surrender. Some of them were intoxicated, smoking, relaxing, and so I captured. Well, Ken Rousey and I captured probably 50 or 60 German infantry.
So what did you do with them once you had them?
Turned them over to the MPs. We radioed and said what we had. And the one thing they didn't want you to do was stop.
Right.
You had to keep moving, because in those days we were dedicated to moving. We were an armored division. We were leading the American Army, and along with other armored divisions. And so we got rid of those prisoners as quickly as we could. We were only with them probably an hour and a half before we were on our way back up to where the action was and where we were moving. So,
do you remember anything about kind of what they looked like? I mean, how old were they? Were they kind of regular military age?
Well, there were some really young people. Really, they looked like teenagers. Some of them. they were all kind of dirty and ratty because the Germans had taken a terrible, as you know, a terrible beating. They were retreating, and some of them were older men, and they looked tired and worn. And I can remember two German soldiers that I saw that day, and the younger of the two, who was probably in his 20s, the older man kept having to poke him with his gun to keep him awake, so he could keep his hands up over his head, because he was so tired and so exhausted and so physically spent that he could just barely walk, leave alone keep his eyes open. The two of them probably hadn't slept for days and days and days. So they were, but I just remember that. It's just something that I actually felt sorry for the youngster, because he was just he'd given everything he had, and we had a lot of respect for the German soldier. He was bright, he was well trained, he was dedicated, and they were very efficient fighters.
During those last few weeks there, as you're going into Germany before you get transferred out, were the Germans putting up much resistance still, or was it just kind of breaking down?
We lost a lot of people in that fluid situation, because the Germans periodically would set up defense posts and entrench themselves, get their armor lined up, and of course we were running across open country trying to cut them off and flank them and cover as many miles as we could. And so it was dangerous work, very dangerous work, very fluid. We were obviously most of us riding in jeeps and half-tracks, which half-tracks are not well armored. And so we sustained a lot of casualties in those days.
Now, at this point, were you still about private, or had you gone up any in rank since then?
I think I finally made PFC at some point. I don't remember, to be honest with you. But I know I was a PFC before I got my commission. But of course, it's quite a change to go from being a private, or even a private first class, to a second lieutenant. Of course, by that, the good news was that I think May 9th was VE Day.
Yeah.
And by the time I got my commission, the war was over in Europe. And of course, at that point, as you remember, everybody in the American, all the service people over there had to be assigned points. And unless you had, I think it was 60 points, you were on your way to Japan to fight the Japanese, because the Japanese were very much still going. And the conventional wisdom was then, as you know, that we were going to have to invade Japan itself, and which they predicted was going to cost us at least 500,000 to 1 million men. And so we were all on our way theoretically on our way to Japan when the bomb was dropped, and of course we never got there because the war was over before we could get to Japan.
Right. Okay. Let's roll back again a little bit. You spent a fair amount of time in Alsace before you moved out to other places. Did you see much at all of the civilian population in that area? And if you did, how did they behave toward you?
Well, the civilian population, of course, were wonderful in France, thrilled to be liberated, but we were so much involved in the weather. The weather was so miserable. I can remember when we were in Rohrweiler in the Battle of Hildesheim, I spent 3 or 4 nights on the few hours when I could sleep. I spent it in a potato bin. I actually slept in a potato bin that was full of potatoes, thank gosh, because potatoes were a lot softer than a lot of other things I could have been lying on, and smelled better than a lot of other things I could be lying on. But I wasn't the only one. There were 2 or 3 of us that considered the potato bin our little sanctuary, a place where we could catch a few hours or minutes of sleep. And then I would go on patrol, or I would go on an errand, or I would run a message, or whatever. I was on call 24 hours. But I can still remember that. But But the German the French civilians in Alsace, even though many of them were of German heritage, they were French and devoted to France and thrilled to be liberated and very helpful to us as much as they could be.
I'm sort of curious about that in part because that was the area that had been contested between the French and the Germans and had gone back and forth a few times.
Absolutely.
And when the Nazis came in, they kind of re-annexed it to Germany. And so they were trying to make it German, but at least...
That's exactly right. And so there were a great many, there were some German sympathizers among some of the French, obviously, who wanted to be annexed as part of Germany, but not many, and nobody that I ran into. I just know this from talking to other men there.
Right.
But we were so busy trying to survive and trying to do our jobs that we didn't have this historical picture.
Right. Sure. Then how was it different when you went over into Germany? I mean, how were the German civilians behaving, or what did they look like to you?
The Germans, I had a wonderful experience with the Germans. Even during the war, the Germans, with one exception, and that is that in one little town, we had a captain by the name of Gagliardi, who was a marvelous, he was one of the superior officers in my battalion. Everybody knew Captain Gagliardi. He was an outstanding officer, a wonderful human being. Everybody had infinite respect. And a German, and elderly, not elderly, but in his 60s, as I recall, German man, shot and killed Captain Gagliardi, who was riding on a tank. And this is when, as I said, we were moving every day in this little town. It was shot out of a basement window and killed. And I might say the reaction was immediate and not unexpected, because he was found. The rifle was found. He verified, yes, he was the shooter, and he was, I don't need to tell you how, but anyway, he didn't survive that day. He was taken out and basically he was eliminated.
Now, aside from that one, and for the most part, how were the German civilians conducting themselves in the areas that you went through?
For the most part, the German civilians that we encountered, and again, this was a relatively brief period after we crossed the Rhine before I was sent back from the front, were cooperative. You would see a kind of a sneer or a grimace once in a while, but basically they were cooperative. They knew the war was over. I think they had anticipated, because obviously the minute we crossed the Rhine, I think it became obvious that they were going to lose the war. But my experience with the German people, both before the war ended and after the war ended, because I was stationed in Germany after the Germans surrendered, was a very good experience with them. The day I was sent back to OCS was interesting because, as I indicated previously, I had a Jeep driver and who was also a private like myself, he was maybe PFC. And my captain,
actually,
and the name has gone right out of my head.
Pause right here because I'm about out of this tape.
Okay, that's good because I'd like to go to the bathroom. Should I lower this blind? Oh, wait a minute, I guess I can't keep the sun out because that's up in the upper window. I guess this bottom blind won't make much difference.
Okay, you were about to talk about the sort of the day that you got transferred over to officer candidate school.
The day my orders had come in and I didn't know it, and I think it actually, my first sergeant had probably been aware that my friend and I had been ordered to OCS several days previously. But in any event, the situation again was so fluid. We were moving constantly, off and on, 24 hours a day. We're moving to try and keep up with our orders and do the things that I had mentioned we were doing. In any event, I got a call on the radio that my captain, who was I thought of his name was Captain Maddox, Maddox, very fine officer, was our company commander. His Jeep hit a mine, destroyed the Jeep. He was not in the Jeep at the time, killed his driver. And my first sergeant called and said, Dilley, bring your Jeep, you're going to OCS because the captain has to have your Jeep. And so that's the first time I learned that, and I had totally forgotten ever applying, leave alone that I would ever be actually going. Learned that I was going to OCS, and I within 3 hours I was gone. I was on my way to the rear in a 6x6 truck with other personnel assigned to various other jobs, and that's when I wound up at Fontainebleau after leaving Paris for a few days. And
okay, so what condition was Paris in at the point when you got there?
well, Paris was, of course, had been liberated some months before, and Paris was full of soldiers of all nations. It was obviously a great gathering point, melting pot, very busy and exciting. And of course, here, the first time I'd ever seen Paris, and a kid from the Midwest, it was quite an experience.
Where'd you stay in Paris? Were there places they had for soldiers?
I really don't remember where I stayed. We were probably given some money to, and just said, you've got so many days of leave. Here's a couple of $100. You're on your own, but report to Fontainebleau at such and such an office on such and such a date. And again, that was, when was that? April 20th. Report April 20th, and so that's when I reported.
Okay. Now, what kind of setup was there at Fontainebleau? I mean, there's a very famous old chateau out there, and there's a lot of countryside around it.
Fontainebleau, as I recall it, was the summer palace of Louis XIV, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, it was the big palace before he built Versailles. So, yeah.
Before he built Versailles. Okay, well, your history is better than mine. But it was beautiful. Very little, if any, damage at all, but had been totally converted to other purposes, including, I think there was a hospital there. I don't remember how many men were involved in the class of officer candidates that I was in, but probably anywhere from 80 to 100. That's just a guess. And we were all in the same class. As I say, it was a 60-day course. We had all kinds of weapons training, all kinds of map reading, compass work, night training. It was just a higher level of the same kind of training that we'd had before.
And what were the backgrounds of the people who were in that school with you? Were they kind of men like yourself, or?
Well, they weren't certainly all college kids like I was, because there were some very, very fine young men who had no college training, but who had distinguished themselves and stamped themselves as officer material,
right?
Who were assigned by their superiors to go through this course and get their commission, rather than just being ordained as by means of a battlefield commission and sent right back into action. Their commanders were smart enough, in my opinion, not to do that to them, to give them a few days off and then send them to good training, a good training school before they got their commissions.
Mm-hmm. Now, were a lot of those men non-coms already, and they were?
Yes, a lot of them were corporals, sergeants, a lot of privates like myself, of all ranks and all backgrounds.
Okay.
Good people, good people.
All right, and so you're in the school still at the point when the European War ends, right?
Yes.
Okay, and so how did people behave or whatever when that news came through?
Well, everybody went nuts. I don't actually remember any particular celebration. I was still at OCS at Fontainebleau when it happened. It's interesting because after I got my commission and was sent to a replacement depot, I don't even remember where the replacement depot was, but while in the replacement depot, President Roosevelt died. I remember that more vividly than when the Germans surrendered. I don't know why, but I just remember the shock of having President Roosevelt dead, who of course was in his third term.
Well, fourth by then, just barely. Fourth term, just barely.
Was it the fourth term?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
He was elected 4 times. He didn't last much of the last term.
Well, that's right, but that's amazing. If he's reelected, just think, nowadays they're limited to 2 terms, but to be reelected a 4th time is just unbelievable. And of course, he was such a great presence and a great unifier in a wonderful effort that America made. And that was more of a shock, really, than VE Day itself.
Well, had your family, your father, been supporters of Roosevelt's before the war, or is this attitude something you basically developed from your war experience?
I'm sorry?
Well, before the war started? I mean, were your family Republicans or Democrats, or?
My family were always Republicans, always Republicans, and I consider myself a flaming liberal, and how that evolved, I can't really tell you. Just or maybe Yale Law School is what did it, because I went to Yale Law School after the war, and maybe that was it. But I don't think so. I think it was just something that happened for no particular reason.
Okay. Now, when did you finish the officer training course?
I think it was June 16th of 1945.
Okay. And then
that would be about a month and a week after VE Day.
Right. And then where were you sent from there?
Well, after the replacement depot, I was assigned to a wonderful, famous division, the 80th Infantry Division, which was the Blue Ridge Division. And the 80th had a wonderful combat record. I was thrilled to be assigned to them, and we were stationed on occupation duty in southern Bavaria, and most beautiful part of Germany, certainly. And I was with them probably 6 or 8 months before I was then reassigned to several different quartermaster trucking companies. And I went to Czechoslovakia with the 80th. I was on occupation duty with the 80th in Czechoslovakia after the war for a brief period, and had a wonderful experience with the 80th Division. But of course, it wasn't my division, but I enjoyed my time with them.
Okay. Now, do you remember hearing the news about the atomic bomb or about the end of the war with Japan?
Oh, absolutely. That was wonderful news, and I think at that point I was with a trucking company. And incidentally, interesting, all the trucking companies I was assigned to, and I think there were either 2 or 3 of them, I could name them, but it's not important, were black personnel. And late in the war, and as you remember, there was segregation all the way through the war. Late in the war, each of the 3 Armored Infantry battalions, including my battalion, were assigned a black company of
Mhm.
soldiers
Mm-hmm.
that joined our armored division as
Mhm.
Company D. We had
Mhm.
Company A, B, C,
Right.
and they became Company D of
Mhm.
each of the 3 Armored Infantry battalions. And I didn't have any close experience with them,
Mhm.
but in my opinion, the black soldiers with whom I did come in contact were outstanding people and
Mhm.
darn good soldiers. And I think the experience, and I can't speak authoritatively because I don't know, but I think the experience of the 12th Armored Division with the black troopers that joined us was excellent.
Yeah. Well, you did get a number of black units that eventually get into combat in some places at the end of the war, and usually, if they had any kind of decent training at all, they did quite well. And there was a very famous tank battalion and some other units, so they're experimenting a little bit
Exactly.
in different ways. Did those companies have black officers or white officers, or do you not remember that?
I think they had white officers,
Mm-hmm.
just like I was a white officer in a black trucking company,
Right.
because they were still segregated.
Right?
Not to say that they might not have had black officers, but I can't really answer that from an experience standpoint, other than the experience I had with the trucking companies.
Mm-hmm. Now, what kinds of work did the trucking company then have to do?
Basically, hauling supplies and personnel.
Mm-hmm.
All you did in a trucking company, you were preoccupied with maintenance of your vehicles because your vehicles had to run
Right.
and run efficiently.
Mm-hmm.
So you were constantly training and preoccupied with maintenance.
Mm-hmm.
I had no particular training or skill as a trucking company officer. I did actually take a class,
Mm-hmm.
mechanical class for the maintenance of vehicles as an officer in a black trucking company. But other than maintenance, all we were doing was transporting personnel and equipment.
Was this a period when you were starting to move a lot of men and equipment out of Germany and sending stuff home, or were you still keeping a lot of those forces there?
Well, we were maintaining, of course, we were an army of occupation in those days.
Mm-hmm.
While we were getting reorganized to go be sent to Japan, so we were doing all kinds of things. And as an officer, I was fortunate enough to be able to do some. I'm a great trout fisherman, fly fisherman, and I somehow acquired some equipment and did some hunting, deer hunting over there. They had deer and they had wild boar and wonderful trout fishing. But of course, all the streams were private. You had to. But after the war, why that didn't mean anything to anybody that could get the equipment. You could go fishing wherever you wanted to. The private property didn't mean anything right after the war. Of course, nowadays I'm sure those streams are private. You can't just as a member of the public you can't fish over there any more than a lot of places here now. You can't fish without permission.
Okay. Now, so about how long was it then before you eventually got to go home? Or
well, I didn't finish about my points. I only had 49 points.
Mm-hmm.
I think you needed 60 to be sent home and discharged. So the fact of the matter is, I didn't get home until June of 1945.
Or 46?
I'm sorry, 46.
Mm-hmm.
June of 1946. And so I was a member of the Army of Occupation in one form or another for over a year, from May and of course from VE Day until June of the following year. And then I just like the rest of us, I got my orders, wound up going to, I think I left Bremerhaven on a ship and got home and wound up, I think I was actually discharged at Camp Cook in Illinois. And my actual active service was about 3 years and 3 months. But I stayed in the reserves for about 7 years. I wasn't discharged until almost the time I got married, which is 1952.
Mm-hmm.
That I stayed in the reserve. So I've forgotten how long my total service was, but I think I served. See if I can find it here.
Well, were you still in the reserves when the Korean War started?
No, I don't think. Well, let me
That's
see.
1950, so.
Here we go. Okay, I left Europe on August 1st in 1946, and I was relieved from active duty September 24th of 46,
Mm-hmm.
and continued thereafter as a member of the Officer Reserve Corps, being finally discharged from Reserve Corps on December 19th, 1952.
Okay.
So I was in from 43 to 52.
But while you were in the Reserve Corps, you did not get called for Korea or anything like that.
I did not get called back to active duty.
Okay.
And I don't remember why I resigned. No particular reason that I can recall.
All right. Once you got back home, then what did you do next? Did you go back to college or what?
Well, I went back to Colgate because, including the credit of, I think, 1 year that I received from my Army
Mm-hmm.
training, plus the time that I was in from September of 1941 until I was called active duty, I only needed 1 year of,
Mm-hmm.
of education to get my college degree. So I went back to Colgate,
Mm-hmm.
graduated in 1946. I'm sorry,
40.
the spring of 47.
Yeah.
Went back in the fall of 46, spring of 47. And immediately went to Yale Law School in the fall of 47, graduated in 1950, and then came back to Grand Rapids.
What was it like to go back to college as an undergraduate there after you'd been in the war and all of this kind of
Well,
thing?
it was very exciting, and of course, I was not unique.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody, almost everybody, not everybody served because some people were disqualified medically or for some reason, or were in a deferred job of some kind.
Mm-hmm.
But it was a wonderful time, and that was when America just took off,
Mm-hmm.
and we were all a part of that, and it was marvelous to be back at Colgate and then go on to law school, and get out and get a job and come home and join my dad in the practice of law and hang on for the ride.
Mm-hmm. Now, was Yale Law School populated with a lot of veterans at that point?
Oh yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, almost everybody was a veteran. Very few that were not veterans,
Mm-hmm.
Which I'm sure was generally true throughout the population of the country.
How do you think your time in the military sort of affected you sort of as a person or shaped how you look at things?
I consider my time in the service as the most valuable and educational experience of my life. I don't know who I would be or what I would be if I hadn't had my time in the service. I think it was a marvelous, wonderful experience. Not only the people with whom I came in contact, the things I learned about myself and about my fellow man, are just something that I cannot quantify or put a price on. It was just invaluable, I think. You had to be very fortunate to survive,
Mm-hmm.
particularly without being wounded or disabled.
Mm-hmm.
I have absolute respect for those who served along with me, whether they survived or didn't survive, particularly those who didn't survive. I have great admiration and respect for. But it was for those of us who came through unscathed, I don't think any of us would trade our experience. At least I wouldn't.
Okay. Are there other memories or things that kind of stick out in your mind here that we haven't recorded here yet?
Not really. I think we've covered it pretty well. Actually, my recollective ability, not very good. I can remember some of the things, and I've tried to describe some of the things that I do remember, but it's not unique to the war that I don't have good recollection. It is pervasive because I don't have very good recollection of a lot of things when I was younger. And I have a couple of friends of mine who can tell me things that I did or things I said that I don't, even when they tell me the story, I can't recall the incident. And of course, they are both gone now too. I've been very fortunate in my life to have lived this long, but those are wonderful experiences, and I just wouldn't trade it for anything.
All right then. Well, thank you very much for talking to me today.
Thank you.